Hello viewers, and welcome yet again to another episode of Dinner Guide this evening. My name is your host, Chef Andy, and today we're going to be working on something very light and simple. We're going to be covering a very beautiful recipe, but before I get there, I will of course take this opportunity to introduce a guest that some of you may have seen on the show before. His name is Preston, but I will of course allow him to say a few words before I proceed and introduce the ingredients for today. Preston.
Thank you, Chef Andy, for the numerous invites. I'm still Preston J1. Yeah, let's do this.
Perfect. How have you been since the last show?
I've been good. I've been trying the recipes, and I'm winning hearts. I'm marrying soon.
Perfect.
I'm getting good feedback from it.
Very good. Very good. Now I hope today I'm going to be able to convince you to also try something a little different. Now on this particular episode, I'm going to be focusing on lasagna, but I'm going to be doing it with a little bit of a twist. We're going to be turning it into Lasagne Roll Ups. Now this is of course pretty much a different way of assembling your lasagna as you normally would, but I will of course give you the hints as we proceed with the show.
Nice. So we are full throttle Italian.
Exactly.
That's good.
Now for this particular recipe, you will require about 6-7 cloves of garlic, 1 whole egg, and 1 whole imported lemon. You'll also require about a 1/4 cup of some grated Parmesan cheese, about 2 medium-sized white onions chopped thinly rather. You'll also require about 50 grams of some mozzarella cheese, some marinara sauce. This is of course store-bought. You'll also require about 10 sheets of lasagna, some fresh coriander leaves, a nice big bundle of some baby spinach. You'll also require about a 1/4 cup of some ricotta cheese, some salt and pepper, which is of course for seasoning, some oil which we'll be frying and cooking with, and last but not least, some water to aid you in blanching your pasta. But before we begin, we'll of course give you this chance to sit back, relax and unwind, and we'll see you after a short break. Basically the white part of the membrane is basically the bitter part, so we begin by slicing that off completely, or rather remove as much of it as you can. And all that you're left to do is proceed to julienne your lemon zest. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Now for those of you who may have missed out on the introduction, we're going to be working on a very simple recipe on this show. We're going to be working on some lasagna roll-ups. Now very important that I do mention that you will of course require lasagna sheets for this particular recipe, as you may not of course be able to pull it off with any other variety of pasta. I will also be using a bit of some mozzarella cheese, a bit of some ricotta, and a bit of some Parmesan. You can of course be able to make your adjustments and your variations depending on your preferences at home, but I do of course recommend the use of all 3 cheeses because it does actually make a big impact, especially with the flavor. I'm also going to be using some baby spinach, but if you do of course only have regular spinach available to you, you can of course be able to use that as well. The particular difference is the baby spinach will of course have a more uplifting and lighter kind of a taste. It will of course also save you quite a bit of time in the process of cleaning and preparing. So this is the one particular reason I prefer to use baby spinach over the regular local spinach. Now we'll begin the process very simply by wilting our spinach in a pan. So we can proceed to turn this one on.
Turn it on.
Also very important to mention, you will require a big pot such as the one at the very end. This is of course already on the boil, and this is of course just to aid us in blanching our lasagna sheets. And of course, last but not least, you'll also require an oven dish or any particular oven dish of your choice. Doesn't matter if it's a non-stick aluminum or even a enamelware or glass. Doesn't really matter. You will of course need one that's at least maybe 1 inch to 2 inches in depth. This is of course going to be able to make sure that you can actually assemble your roll-ups and you can actually be able to cover them with a sauce. And of course, just before we begin, very important that you start off by adding some oil into a hot pan. So I'm going to drizzle over about 1 tablespoon. So I'm using...
Your mozzarella looks a little bit creamy. So, and there's other mozzarella that is white.
Yes. So the mozzarella that I'm using, this is a local variety mozzarella, rather. Now there is one that you always find packaged in a bit of some salt water.
Yeah.
So that is buffalo mozzarella. That of course is a little higher in price. So this is basically why I opted for this particular local one, because it's a little easier to find and locally, also a little more affordable. Nice. But of course you do of course find the original mozzarella that is of course sold, and it's actually dipped in a bit of water. Now the beautiful thing about it, it's also very, very rich and creamy. But it's of course also very, very hard to handle, especially for such a recipe. So that one would particularly maybe work better for a different recipe. But of course it is still mozzarella cheese.
Oh.
Yeah.
Thank you for the indulgence.
Welcome. So now we're going to jump into the beginning process of making our spinach. Just going to grab these pieces of garlic. Now what we're going to do is we're pretty much going to begin by sauteing our onions. So I'm going to add those into the pan first. And you can of course proceed to mix that through. We will be cooking those right up until they're almost softened up and almost brown in color. While Preston does so, I'm also going to begin to pound down my garlic. And I'll of course start by adding some salt into a pestle and mortar. Proceed to mince your garlic, pounding down as you continue, and of course turning your mortar around continuously. So Preston, I don't know if you've actually tried making a lasagna on your own at home.
I've tried making, I love pastas. My favorite is macaroni and penne pasta. I only love spaghetti because I can play with it while eating.
Exactly.
But lasagna, I've tried like 5 times. Always backfires, so you don't know how glad I am to be here today.
To actually be witnessing a lasagna.
Lasagna with a professional himself, Chef.
Thank you. Now we will of course be touching on some little bits of an original lasagna. But of course, as I mentioned, due to the fact I'm going to be turning it to roll-ups, the only difference is basically in the assembly. But pretty much most of the rest of the process is very similar. So into your sauteed onions, proceed to add your minced garlic. So that should give you about 1 beautiful heaped tablespoon. Once that is added, we're also going to be incorporating a bit of some lemon zest. So for this particular process, you will of course require just the skin of the lemon. So I'm going to begin by slicing very, very thinly the green most outer part of your lemon. And you'll require about 3 beautiful elongated slices for this.
Do we need to reduce the fire?
Yeah, you can maintain it at a bit. Yeah, you can actually lower it very, very slightly. So we'll keep the temperature very low for the fact that we're also not trying to cook down the onions completely. And I'll add just a little bit of water. This is of course to aid in cooling down the pan. And it will also rush the process of infusing the garlic. Right, so once you've peeled about 3 equal slices of your lemon. Proceed to turn the skin over and proceed to slice out that inner white membrane of the lemon. Remember, this is of course going to make your zest quite bitter, so be sure to remove that before proceeding to slice that very, very thinly. Now, one particular tip I'm also going to share with you on the show today is the use of lemon zest. Now, on many occasions, you will find that you can, of course, incorporate lemon juice to a dish, and you may, of course, not want the qualities of the lemon juice, which is, of course, the acidic part of the juice. But you can, of course, also use the lemon skins, which will, of course, give a lemon flavor without, of course, giving it that strong hint of lemon juice, which is, of course, very acidic. And they also give a nice, beautiful color. So once we've taken, so basically the white part of the membrane is basically the bitter part. So we begin by slicing that off completely, or rather remove as much of it as you can. And all that you're left to do is proceed to julienne your lemon zest, looking for about 1 leveled tablespoon of lemon zest. Right, so begin by slicing those into some nice equal julienne and proceed to chop that as finely as you possibly can. Making sure that you always keep the pieces very, very tiny so that you can actually be able to enjoy your dish without actually being able to bite into any of the lemon pieces. Right, so into our pan goes our lemon zest. That's of course the name that we would normally use. Now, as I mentioned, we're of course trying to keep the mixture very, very dry, so this is the reason why we didn't add any of the lemon juice. And of course, once that's done, all you need to do is proceed to add your baby spinach. So begin by assembling a few of your leaves onto your hands, and of course making sure that this is of course washed and allowed to drain completely. Proceed to just tear off the stems and proceed to add your pieces or the leafy pieces of your baby spinach. Now, something also to share with you viewers at home, baby spinach is of course also a very, very rare product to find in the market. I think I've actually almost managed to find baby spinach available in maybe about 3-4 outlets here in the city. But you can of course be able to alterate this with some regular local spinach. But of course, do remember you will of course need to really chop it very, very finely, just to make sure that it actually can be able to be incorporated into the dish without having to expose the nice big leaves. All you need to do is proceed to add that into your pan. And this is basically a wilting process, so we don't really want to cook them down. We're basically just softening the leaves.
Just soften them and
exactly.
Maybe allow some little marination with the ginger.
Exactly, and basically just to give it a bit of flavor. We're also going to be seasoning with a bit of some salt and black peppercorns just to finish off. And as I finish off the baby spinach, making sure of course that you also have a bowl that is completely free of worms or any particular sand particles. Begin to finish your process off and add the last and final bit of your spinach into your pan, and proceed to discard the stems completely. You can of course be able to keep this and use a little later if you're going to of course be making some stock or some vegetable reductions. And once your spinach is just almost completely wilted, proceed to season with some salt. And crush in some black peppercorns. And basically, as I mentioned, that should take anywhere between 6 to 7 minutes to complete the process, taking of course more time to saute your onions and of course your garlic, making sure that your onions are completely softed through before you proceed to remove this from the heat and allow it to cool off completely. So we can proceed to turn that off, Preston.
The water, right?
No, this one. Yeah. Right, and you can pour that into the bowl. Right, and as Preston finishes off with the spinach, we're of course going to go into the next part of the dish. Now we're going to mix our cheese, basically the cheese that we're going to be incorporating into our roll-ups a little later. And for that, you will, of course, require a clean bowl to begin with, and, of course, a whisk or any particular tool that can, of course, make it much easier for you to give that a smooth and even mixture. So all we need to do now is allow this to cool off, and then we're pretty much going to incorporate it into the pasta a little later. Right, so next up, we're going to proceed to make our cheese filling. So for this, you'll require your Parmesan cheese. I'm also going to be cracking in 1 whole egg. And just to finish that off, proceed to add your ricotta cheese, and all you're left to do is mix that through. It. Yes, basically making sure that we try and incorporate or combine the ricotta and the Parmesan, making a one consistent mixture.
Plus the egg.
Yes. And now something also to mention, for those of you who may of course not be big fans of incorporating eggs to your pasta dish, you can of course also use such ingredients as whipping cream or a little bit of some regular milk. And this is of course just going to aid you in making sure that you can actually break down the chunks of your ricotta, making it much easier for you to be able to scoop out a little later and move those onto your roll-ups once the pasta is done. Right, now we're pretty much coming closer and closer to the very end. I will of course mention there is only a few ingredients left over, which, as I mentioned, we are going to be using to incorporate into our dish. But before we take our first break, I will of course take you through the very, very simple process of finishing off or pre-cooking your pasta sheets. Now remember, these are pretty much, of course, on many occasions, I think you've actually used this in their whole size as they are.
Yeah.
So we're basically going to blanch them, which is something that most of the lasagna preparation would not require. So in assembling a lasagna, you'd basically use them raw. But we're going to be blanching them for about 4 to 6 minutes, right up until they're almost al dente. Right, now this is also ready. So I'm just going to shake the excess off completely, making sure, of course, not to waste any of your cheese. Is there any particular cheese you're a big fan of, especially with your pasta?
I just shop cheese. I don't.
You don't really go for any particular
brand?
I
don't really, because things to do with anything that has lactose. I don't pay too much attention. So long as I check and I'm like, the milk content is lower, I go for it. I told you I'm more lactose intolerant.
Exactly. Now, the sheets that we're going to be using are of course made from wheat flour. So this of course wouldn't qualify for the option that you had gone for, which is of course ones that are gluten free. But you can, of course, be able to find lasagna sheets in the market, some, of course, with a bit of brown flour, semolina flour, or potato flour. So I know at the moment it's probably a little harder to find them in the city. But, of course, for some of the viewers at home who are also very, very curious to know, there are, of course, some very, very high, maybe highly priced and high-end retail stores that are making pasta fresh at the moment. And I also know of a few people out here who can actually be able to make some lasagna sheets for you from scratch. So if you can also be able to check even with the Asian supermarkets, you may actually be able to find some chefs who can actually be able to make your lasagna sheets from scratch. And the only beautiful thing about them doing it for you is the fact that they also already have the flours that we had mentioned, which are of course much harder to find in the supermarkets, but the Asian community probably uses more of them than we do.
Some people tend to overly wash their pasta just to get rid of the more much carbohydrates,
the gluten itself,
make it more gluten free.
Now, one thing I can probably share with you as well, no matter how many times you rinse out your pasta, you can never get the gluten out.
It is still carbs.
It is still carbs and it cannot change. Basically because of the fact that it does incorporate flour into it, wheat flour. The only particular way you can be able to assure yourself that you're having gluten-free pasta is, of course, by making sure that the flour that made it, of course, did not contain wheat.
And also that contributes to like people having overcooked pasta.
Exactly.
People don't know that pasta has to be al dente.
Yes, that's actually a very, very important thing to mention.
Some people just
thinking
dip in the water and then they wait for the water
to completely go murky and white.
It's porridge.
And also another thing very important to mention as well, and it's something I've also mentioned to a guest on the show before. I've also heard of maybe cooks out there who pretty much throw their pasta into cold water, and as soon as the water begins to boil, everything becomes mush. Now, of course, the most important and the best, safest way to get your pasta to cook very, very easily and, of course, maintain that beautiful bite to it, one particular thing you can do is, of course, read the instructions at the back of your packaging. It will, of course, always give you the preferred cooking time, and that will, of course, always give you the al dente consistency that you're looking for. And if you cook, of course, any more longer than the time that is prescribed on the packet, it will, of course, turn into
Some people
mash.
say that after you switched off the gas, it keeps on cooking itself. So most people, before they mix with the gravy or whatever they're making, especially for spaghetti, they rinse it in cold water.
Perfect. Now, this is exactly the technique we're going to be using on the show. So what we're going to do is you can lift the lid off on that end completely. You can actually just place it up here.
The lid. Now let me place it this way.
Right. Now, very importantly, before you begin to cook or parboil your pasta, make sure that you have some salt in the water. Now, two beautiful things that the salt is responsible for: it actually makes sure that your sheets will not actually stick to each other, and it'll actually make sure that any of that murky, consistent liquid that you get after poaching your pasta is not, of course, going to get them to stick together. So what we're going to do is we're going to drop about 3 pieces at a time. So I'll allow you to throw those in just as they are. And this should actually take about 4 to 5 minutes to blanch each of the pieces. So we're just basically going to be doing them in small circles just to make sure that we get the consistency right. And now, just to mention on the last and final part, I don't have some ice with me, but I will, of course, mention you can, of course, have a bowl of water with a bit of some ice cubes. That's, of course, going to make sure that they cool off a little faster. But another alternative is actually rinsing them under some running water in the tap. And this is basically the fastest way to cool your pasta down and avoid it from overcooking. So for some of you who are watching as well, remember, if you do actually want to cool off your pasta, you will have to take it out of the water and move it into some cold water to avoid it from overcooking. So leaving it in the water and turning off the gas, it won't change anything.
Keeps on cooking,
it's basically just going to continue.
More softer, and
exactly.
Pasta is not nice when it's too soft in the mouth.
Exactly. Right, so in a separate bowl, I'm just going to add some cold water.
Yes.
Now this is, of course, room temperature water. As I mentioned, I would prefer to use ice, which I don't have at the moment.
Yes.
But of course, if you are looking at a very, very good result, I always recommend work with room temperature water. It's actually also not going to shock your pasta, and it may also cool your pasta a little more gradually, making sure that you get that al dente perfect.
Oh, nice. So
right,
I will retrieve it.
So now we're just going to give that a check. Let me just get this out of the way.
Just pinch on.
So what we're going to do is, because the pasta will, of course, tear very, very easily when you hold it with tongs.
So we
so
scoop it.
What we normally do is we're going to be using a flat lifter to just lift one sheet up first, just to make sure. And what will happen is, as you lift your sheets, they will, of course, tend to bend as they continue to cook. So what I like to pretty much use is my nail. So I try and actually pinch a bit of the pasta out. If it's still very hard for you to be able to pinch a piece out of it by using your nail, then it means it needs just a bit more time to cook.
The mistake I usually do, I use my teeth.
No, even by biting is actually a very, very good technique. And on many occasions as well, I've actually also used the same technique before. You can actually try and break a piece of the pasta by hand and try and press it very hard between your fingertips. If it goes mushy very, very quickly, then it's overcooked. But if you actually struggle to mash it with your fingertips, then it's actually the correct consistency we are looking for. Now, before we actually proceed to the next step, we will, of course, have to finish this very, very simple process. But I will, of course, continue to do so while we go on to the break. But when we do come back, I will, of course, be able to show you the pasta technique, the rolling technique of the roll-up for the lasagna. And we're also going to be jumping into the next step of assembling our very simple lasagna roll-up. So please don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. Right, so we will, of course, require just one more piece to complete the process. I'm just going to set the remaining bit of our lasagna sheets at the back. Remember, this you can of course be able to use. This of course you may not be able to use for this particular recipe if your dish is completely full. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. If you've missed out on what we've done on the show today, remember you can recap by subscribing to our YouTube channel. That's BrandPlus TV Kenya, where you will be able to catch up on this and many other previous episodes that you may have missed out in the recent past. But for now, just to bring you back to scratch, we've pretty much been working on some of the ingredients that we're going to be using for the filling. We're pretty much now finishing off the last bit of pasta, so we'll proceed to add those 2 sheets. And as I mentioned before we went on break, very simple technique. Blanch your pasta for about 4 to 5 minutes. Drain your pasta, or rather cool your pasta in some cold water. And you can actually lay off your sheets on a very flat surface, such as the one I'm using on right on the front of us. And this is basically just to aid in allowing you to be able to actually lift them from the tray and actually proceed to assemble them as you would for a lasagna roll-up. Now, as those last few pieces continue to cook, we'll of course jump into the assembling process of the last part of our dish. So for that, you will require a bit of some marinara sauce, which will of course begin by adding that into our baking tray or our baking dish. And now all we are left to do is basically assemble everything that we did in the beginning. So I'm just going to begin by bringing forward the fillings that we're going to be using. Now, before we begin the process, I'm of course going to portion out our mozzarella cheese. So I'm just going to cut those into some nice sizable chunks. Right, once that's done, all you're left to do is proceed to assemble your dish. So begin the process by having a bit of some marinara sauce in the container. This is of course to make sure that it's of course very easy to lift once it's ready. And this of course also makes sure that it doesn't also stick to the base. Right, so we'll begin the first process very simply by grabbing one of our lasagna sheets. And all you need to do is proceed to place that on your board and proceed to add your piece of mozzarella. Next, proceed to scoop a little bit of your spinach filling. Place that right over the top and proceed to do the same thing by adding your ricotta mixture. And once that's done, all you need to do now is proceed to roll that, making sure of course that your roll up is as tight as possible. So roll that to the very end, and once done, all you need to do is proceed to set that inside your dish or your container that you're going to be baking your dish in. Very important also to make sure that your oven is preheated. So I'm just going to preheat my oven as we continue to assemble these. And all we need to do now is proceed to do the same thing for the rest of our pieces. So I'm just going to move a few of our lasagna sheets onto my chopping board here.
Am I allowed to try?
Yes. Actually proceed with the rest as we did. So very important that you of course also have a bit of some lasagna sheets of course in excess. Remember, you may of course begin the process and your mixture could actually run out, or your mixture could actually be a little bit in excess. So be sure to actually have an adequate amount of lasagna sheets for this recipe. Of course, making sure that they will all be able to fit in the container that you'll be baking in. And of course, once that is of course full at the end of the process, you can of course proceed to bake your first batch, and you can repeat the process thereafter. Of course, once you've actually taken the roll-ups out of the marinara mixture or out of the baking tray, and proceed to basically plate them thereafter. Perfect. Now we're just going to continue to do the same. Exactly. So we continue continue to do the same. So as you can see, we already have about 2 pieces in there, which means we should actually be able to cover that up with about 2 or 3 more pieces. And of course, very, very important to mention, be sure that your pasta is of course not overcooked. You should actually be able to play around with your piece of your lasagna sheet very, very easily. This is of course to make sure that it's also easy to bend. And now of course, as you finish off the dish, very, very important to also remember, you will of course require some marinara sauce to cover the mixture completely. So be sure to actually have an adequate amount of some marinara sauce. This is of course to make sure that once your roll-ups come out of the oven, they're also not very, very dry, and that they're also beautifully succulent and of course coated very, very beautifully with a bit of some marinara sauce. We're also going to be topping that up with a bit of some cheese. So I'm just going to grab a bit of some Parmesan cheese at the back. And this we're basically going to be drizzling in a couple. We're basically going to be drizzling this right over the top as soon as all our rollouts are completed. So I'm using some already grated Parmesan cheese. You can of course be able to buy your cheese by the block and of course grate it to order, or grate it as soon as you're basically ready to assemble your lasagna roll-up.
Is that enough?
Right, so we will of course require just 1 more piece to complete the process. And I'm just going to set the remaining bit of our lasagna sheet at the back. Remember, this you can of course be able to use. This of course you may not be able to use for this particular recipe if your dish is completely full. So you can of course be able to, right? Yes. You can of course be able to save up your pieces of your sheets, and you can of course be able to bake this in a second portion right after this is completely done. Now, very, very important to also remind you, remember that this is of course not seasoned, so you will of course require a bit of salt and pepper to season. You can of course also drizzle a little bit of some olive oil right over the top before you proceed to finish off the process. And this will do of course 2 things. It will give it a nice beautiful flavor as well. And it's also going to give a nice beautiful finish and shine to your lasagna pieces. Perfect. Right, so if you can of course be able to see that very, very clearly from the cameras, as soon as you've got all your ingredients laid out as we pretty much done, you can finish off by adding the last few pieces of your...
Still bring?
Yeah. So what we do is we're pretty much not going to waste any of the mixture. So you can actually scoop that and just scatter it right over the top. Yep. And you can also crumble a bit of your mozzarella cheese that's left over. Remember, this is of course going to melt and give it a nice beautiful coating right over the top. And it's also going to bake and give a very, very beautiful color once it comes out of the oven. Perfect. Right, so once that's done, all we need to do now is finish off by topping this up with our marinara sauce. So using a spoon, proceed to scoop the mixture and spread very few bits right over the top, making sure to cover each one. And then right at the very end, you can pretty much drizzle over the rest. Remember, something also very, very crucial, especially if you're going to be working with cheeses, remember you're also not limited to using ones that are pretty much favorable to you. You can of course be able to use many kinds of different kinds of cheeses, of course depending on what particular flavors you're looking at the end of the process. Perfect. Right, and then the last bit, we're pretty much just going to drizzle that right over the top. And once done, we're also going to proceed to scatter some of the cheese right over the top. And of course, very, very important to mention, make sure your oven is pretty much preheated in good time. Remember, you of course also don't want to hold the mixture too long. The pasta will of course continue to become very, very gummy in the process. So very, very important that once you're done, it goes straight into a hot preheated oven. So we're just going to top the rest of it with all the cheese. So remember something as well that you should always remember with a lasagna or any particular such dish. Right, so once this is done, all we're left to do is, of course, season it very, very lightly over the top with some black peppercorns. Sprinkle some salt right over the top as well. And of course, just to finish this off, very important that you also give it a bit of color.
Yeah.
So for that, we're also going to be improvising with some freshly chopped coriander. So using a sharp knife, proceed to chop that as finely as you possibly can. Right, so once that's done, pretty much scatter your freshly chopped coriander right over the top. And this will, of course, melt into the cheese, giving it also a very, very beautiful appearance over the top. And all we're left to do is move that into the oven so you can grab the dish as it is. And all you're left to do now is push it right at the very back. That should be the hottest point of your oven. And now all we're left to do is allow that to cook until the cheese is completely melted. And once that's done, we'll pretty much take it out of the oven and proceed on to the last and final stage, which is the plating. But before we do so, another very short break, and we'll see you in a little while.
True, and the aroma is...
And the aroma is as good, yeah?
Now this smells like now pure Italian pasta.
Perfect.
Lasagna
Well said.
smell. Yeah.
Well said. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. If you've been tuning into the show right up to this point, we've pretty much finished our dish for today. So I'm going to begin by taking this out of the oven. Right, Preston, as you can be able to see, as I mentioned, very, very important that the cheese gets enough time in the oven to melt.
Yeah.
So this we've pretty much been cooking for about 20 minutes.
20, yeah.
So as you can be able to see, nice and
Yeah, the
crispy right at the
coriander
top.
looks so crispy.
The coriander looks nice and crispy. So all we left to do now is proceed to move this onto the plate. So start off very, very simply by working around the sides. This is, of course, to make sure to detach any bits of your lasagna that may be stuck to your pan. And all that you're left to do is proceed to move that onto your plate.
Ooh.
Now, as you can be able to see, as I mentioned, very, very simple. Very small adjustment from the usual lasagna arrangement,
Yeah,
which
true
of
that.
course would need
Which
us
was
to
super flat and just layered.
and then layer everything together. But this, of course, is also one particular similar idea to the lasagna. You can, of course, be able to incorporate all the sauces that you would, and you can actually be able to reassemble your lasagna into this particular method.
Yes.
And it actually also makes it much easier for you to plate.
True, and the aroma is...
And the aroma is as good, yeah?
Now this smells like now pure Italian pasta.
Perfect.
Lasagna
Well said.
smell. Yeah.
Well said. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the last and final part of the show. I will, of course, allow you to do the honors of closing the show for us.
So now, Andy, I'm waiting to taste.
I'm sure
the
you
lasagna.
are. I'm definitely sure you are.
I love the show.
Mm-hmm.
You guys, if you want to turn your kitchen upside down and look all good and make everyone love you for the tasty food that you make sure you're watching this show. I've been here for this is the fourth episode.
Fourth episode, yes.
I like the experience. I've learned too much. I've told you people are loving me, even those who didn't love me, because man, I'm rocking their stomachs.
That is
their
exactly
taste
what
buds.
we were aiming at.
Yeah. Thank you
Right.
very much.
So very important that we mention, you can also be able to be here just like our visitor or our guest did on the show today. by simply texting the 5-digit code on your screens. Do write to us and give us an idea of where you're from, what you're about, what you do, your likes and dislikes in cooking, and maybe something you're interested in learning in the studios with us. And we'll be more than happy to answer your call and accommodate you. But from us, it's a simple goodbye. Stay blessed and see you soon.